Everything changed the instant a silent valve turned energy into political force. The decision was not announced with speeches or emergency summits. It arrived as a technical adjustment, buried in flow data and pressure readings, executed through state-controlled infrastructure with deliberate restraint. Gas volumes from Russia into Europe fell sharply, not because of storms, accidents, or market failure, but because the Kremlin chose constriction as policy. This was authority expressed through pipelines. It was quiet, legal on paper, and devastating in design. For years, European leaders had treated energy as a solved problem. Roughly 40% of imported natural gas came from Russia, feeding power grids, heating systems, and the industrial backbone of the continent. Long-term contracts, interdependence rhetoric, and regulatory optimism produced a belief that disruption would be brief, absorbable, and ultimately reversible. Storage levels, alternative suppliers, and financial buffers were cited as shields. Confidence replaced caution without ceremony. What made the moment decisive was timing. The reduction arrived after sanctions hardened positions and narrowed diplomatic exits. It landed as inflation was already accelerating and supply chains were still fragile. Energy prices reacted instantly, but the deeper effect was psychological. A foundational assumption collapsed that economic integration restrained geopolitical coercion. Energy was no longer a background utility. It became leverage, measurable, and repeatable. No factories shut down that day. No cities went dark. The surface remained intact, which made the danger harder to see. Beneath it, exposure was total, and the system had just been tested by an actor willing to pull again. Europe did not stumble into dependency. It constructed it deliberately, layer by layer, over decades. Pipeline routes were political instruments disguised as infrastructure, locking supply to geography and supplier power. Industrial policy rewarded cheapest input over resilient access, pushing energy-intensive production outward while deepening reliance at home. Long-term gas contracts promised stability, indexed to formulas that favored short-term savings and penalized flexibility. Each decision narrowed optionality, but none triggered alarm because the system appeared efficient. Regulators reinforced the illusion. Liberalized markets were designed to optimize price discovery, not security of supply. Storage obligations were treated as commercial preferences rather than strategic requirements. Environmental targets accelerated the retirement of dispatchable power without replacing it at scale. The assumption was moral as much as technical. Interdependence would civilize behavior, and contracts would restrain coercion. Strategic planning gave way to compliance frameworks and quarterly benchmarks. When warnings surfaced, they were absorbed and neutralized. Diversification was declared, not executed. Terminals were planned but not built. Interconnectors were debated while capacity remained static. The industrial base adjusted by trimming margins and outsourcing risk, assuming continuity would persist. Policymakers cited liquidity, spot markets, and allies as substitutes for physical molecules that did not yet exist. The narrative turns here, quietly and decisively. Dependency ceases to be an oversight and reveals itself as a structural trap. At industrial scale, substitution is not a switch, but a multi-year reconstruction involving capital, permits, labor, and social consent. None of those can be accelerated by rhetoric. As flows tighten, leaders discover that optionality was spent long ago, and every alternative carries delay, cost, or political fracture. Markets registered the truth faster than institutions, repricing risk and exposing fragility without offering relief. Capital hesitated, insurers recalculated, and executives postponed commitments, waiting for signals that never arrived, while the structure they relied on remained intact only by habit. Gas stopped behaving like a commodity the moment it was rationed with intent. Volumes were reduced in calibrated steps, announced as technical disputes and maintenance cycles, synchronized with political statements denying responsibility. Prices responded instantly, multiplying across spot markets, futures, and collateral requirements. This was not volatility, it was signal transmission. Moscow demonstrated that control over marginal supply translated directly into leverage over price, planning horizons, and public patience. Sanctions had targeted banks, individuals, and trade flows, but energy operated on a different plane. Financial penalties could be rerouted, litigated, or absorbed. Gas could not. It powered electricity, heat, fertilizer, and steel simultaneously. Every reduction propagated through grids and contracts without requiring enforcement. The move landed harder because it exploited physics, not law. It imposed scarcity that no court could suspend and no communique could reverse. Political messaging followed a strict script. Responsibility was denied. Compliance was asserted. European consumers were blamed for regulatory failures. The point was not persuasion, but exhaustion. Each statement reinforced the same reality. Supply would move only on terms set in Moscow. Energy ceased to be a traded good and became a conditional permission. Markets attempted correction and failed. Liquidity evaporated as margin calls accelerated. Utilities faced insolvency despite full order books. Governments intervened to guarantee trades, distorting price signals further. Emergency caps and subsidies slowed visible collapse while deepening structural imbalance. The feedback loop broke. The narrative shift was unavoidable. This was no longer an economic disagreement governed by incentives. It was a power confrontation conducted through infrastructure embedded inside civilian life. Every response carried delay, cost, and political exposure. As normal governance bent under emergency measures, the central question hardened into place. Retaliation required leverage Europe no longer clearly possessed. That absence, once theoretical, now constrained every decision, narrowing options while amplifying the risk of each imperfect move made under pressure and observed by adversaries without delay windows. The industrial impact unfolded in a strict sequence, dictated by energy intensity rather than political priority. Chemical plants were first because gas was not an input but a feedstock. Ammonia production halted, fertilizer output collapsed, and downstream agriculture immediately lost supply certainty. Steel followed, as blast furnaces could not operate intermittently without damage. Glass and ceramics shut down next, their kilns designed for continuous heat cycles that made high prices indistinguishable from outages. Heavy manufacturing entered suspension not through bankruptcy filings, but through controlled shutdowns meant to limit irreversible loss. Margins disappeared before production stopped. Energy costs multiplied beyond the value of finished goods, converting full order books into liabilities. Firms faced a mechanical choice: operate at guaranteed loss or idle capacity and preserve capital. Many chose idling, discovering that restart timelines stretched into months and in some cases became technically impossible. Skilled labor dispersed, maintenance was deferred, equipment degraded in silence. These were not temporary pauses, they were structural amputations. The crisis crossed a line here. What had been modeled as a pricing problem became a physical shortage of output. Fertilizer scarcity threatened yields. Steel shortages delayed infrastructure and defense contracts. Packaging constraints rippled into food distribution. Each shutdown propagated outward, compounding effects that no single subsidy could isolate. Governments confronted unemployment spikes concentrated in industrial regions already politically brittle. Emergency support followed, but it carried its own distortions. Subsidies preserved payrolls while masking non-viable operations. Price caps protected consumers while accelerating fiscal exposure. State aid rules were suspended, favoring countries with deeper balance sheets and fragmenting the internal market. The mechanism was clear. Intervention slowed collapse locally while accelerating divergence systemically. Executives stopped planning expansions and shifted to survival horizons measured in weeks. Insurers reassessed coverage. Credit tightened against energy exposure. The industrial base, once assumed permanent, revealed itself as conditional on inputs now rationed by geopolitics. Whether emergency measures were buying time or freezing decline remained unanswered, but the machinery that once powered Europe was no longer reliably running, and restarting it would require conditions that did not yet exist. States moved quickly, not decisively. Price caps were imposed to suppress visible pain, disconnecting retail bills from wholesale reality. Rationing frameworks followed, formalizing scarcity through administrative order rather than market signal. Utilities were nationalized or backstopped as private balance sheets collapsed under margin calls. Each intervention was justified as temporary, targeted, and necessary. Together, they rewrote the rules of economic governance in real time. Free market doctrine was suspended without repeal, replaced by emergency clauses and fiscal guarantees. Debt financed the gap between controlled prices and uncontrolled costs. Exposure ballooned as states assumed risks once dispersed across firms and consumers. Legal exceptions multiplied. Competition law was waived. State aid limits were suspended, and procurement rules were bypassed. Authority centralized under executive discretion, narrowing parliamentary oversight by necessity. The contradiction hardened. Governments preached discipline while printing liquidity, competition while selecting winners, stability while improvising policy. Confidence did not return. Markets interpreted intervention not as reassurance, but as confirmation of systemic distress. Bond spreads widened, currencies weakened, and investment timelines froze. Households accepted controls reluctantly. Businesses complied because alternatives no longer existed. Emergency governance extended itself by precedent. What began as stabilization increasingly resembled a holding pattern sustained by consent under strain. Legal authority remained intact, but legitimacy thinned as promises of normality receded. Elections loomed, budgets stretched, and emergency powers quietly normalized. Every decree solved an immediate problem while compounding the next. The system functioned, but only by contradicting itself. Whether democratic consent could endure governance defined by permanent exception remained unanswered. Courts deferred, regulators complied, and administrative capacity replaced deliberation. This was erosion by procedure, not rupture by force. As costs accumulated off balance sheet and expectations hardened, the distance between control and consent narrowed dangerously. Institutions held, yet the framework sustaining them depended on patience that emergency rule was steadily consuming. How long that patience would last was the only variable no statute could secure. Material stress translated into social fracture with mechanical speed. Household energy bills doubled and then detached from wages entirely, converting utilities into monthly crises. Inflation ceased to be abstract and became domestic, measured in skipped meals, delayed rent, and heated arguments at kitchen tables. Governments urged conservation while enforcing payment, and the contradiction registered immediately. Compliance thinned where legitimacy felt transactional rather than reciprocal. Protest movements emerged without coordination, driven less by ideology than exhaustion. Demonstrations blocked roads, ports, and refineries, targeting symbols of continuity rather than specific policies. Union unrest followed, first defensive, then confrontational. Strikes spread across transport, manufacturing, and public services, compounding disruption and amplifying visibility. Collective bargaining hardened into brinkmanship as labor demanded insulation from costs the state could no longer absorb quietly. Political responses polarized at speed. Incumbents lost ground as polling reflected a sharp collapse in trust, not because alternatives were credible, but because continuity was no longer tolerable. Extremist parties reframed the crisis as betrayal, assigning blame with moral certainty and offering restoration without mechanisms. Their appeal was not policy, but clarity. In conditions of scarcity, certainty outperformed competence. Leadership encountered incompatible demands. Households demanded relief. Industries demanded protection. Fiscal authorities demanded restraint. International partners demanded alignment. No configuration satisfied all without violating another constraint. Each concession accelerated alienation elsewhere. Messaging shifted from reassurance to endurance, signaling permanence unintentionally. The social contract strained under sustained extraction without visible recovery. The crisis crossed its most dangerous threshold here. It left expert circles and entered mass psychology. Expectations reset downward. Citizens adjusted behavior toward self-preservation, withdrawing consent incrementally rather than revolting openly. This was not panic, it was adaptation. Institutions still functioned, but authority thinned as obedience became conditional and transactional. History offers patterns for such moments, and none resolve cleanly. Sustained material decline tests systems built on growth assumptions and deferred costs. Whether existing political structures could absorb prolonged contraction without rupturing under accumulated grievance remained unanswered, but pressure was no longer theoretical. It was distributed, visible, and increasingly indifferent to procedural legitimacy, waiting only for a catalyst sufficient to convert erosion into breakage. This was never an energy crisis. It was the exposure of a strategic illusion sustained by habit, comfort, and institutional denial. Energy merely revealed it. When leverage was applied, the structure failed exactly where it had been weakened over time. Governance that optimized efficiency over resilience, industry that traded permanence for margin, and leadership that substituted moral posture for power assessment. The breakdown was not sudden, it was activated. Responsibility crystallizes here, and it is diffuse by design. No single shutdown caused this outcome. It emerged from decades of decisions that assumed constraints could be outsourced indefinitely. Strategic realism was replaced with procedural confidence. Dependency was moralized, not mitigated. Warnings were absorbed as noise because acknowledging them required sacrifice before necessity. When necessity arrived, sacrifice became compulsory and insufficient. Once leverage was pulled, outcomes followed mechanical logic. Industrial contraction was not a risk but a certainty. Energy-intensive production cannot be willed back by subsidies or slogans. Supply chains do not reassemble on political timelines. Capital does not return to jurisdictions where inputs are conditional. Even alternative energy flows, when secured, arrive into a system already altered. Lost capacity does not wait. Governments frame the response as temporary disruption on the path to renewal. The record shows something else, a long-term reduction in industrial depth, strategic autonomy, and fiscal flexibility. This is not collapse by catastrophe, but by attrition, the kind that leaves institutions standing while hollowing their function, the kind that shifts influence outward without formal surrender. The final judgment is unavoidable. Europe mistook stability for security and legality for leverage. It believed integration neutralized coercion and that markets would correct political asymmetry. Those beliefs were tested and failed under pressure. What remains is adaptation to diminished options, not restoration of the previous order. There is no concluding fix to offer because the damage is already embedded. The system will continue operating, but on altered terms, with reduced tolerance for shock and narrower margins for error. Strategic illusions rarely announce their end. They are dismantled by events that prove, conclusively, that power does not negotiate with assumptions.